Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into a really fascinating question that comes up in biblical prophecy. Are believers going to be taken from the earth before a major time of global crisis? We're going to break down the three core arguments for what's known as the pre-tribulation rapture, based on the source material. So let's jump right in.
It all really boils down to this one central question. Will the church, and that means all believers, have to endure the prophesied 7-year period called the tribulation? The viewpoint we're exploring today builds a really strong case that the answer to that question is a clear no.
Okay, before we get into the weeds, let's make sure we're all on the same page with two key terms. Over on the left, we have the rapture. That's the moment believers are caught up from the earth. And on the right, the tribulation, that future 7-year period of intense judgment. Understanding that these are two separate things is absolutely essential for the rest of our discussion.
So, how is this case built? Well, the source material we're looking at lays out three distinct lines of evidence. First, we'll look at a specific promise of protection. Then, a prophecy that's focused squarely on Israel. And finally, the chronological flow of the book of Revelation, before we put it all together at the end.
All right, first up, the promise of protection. The whole argument here is that believers aren't just promised protection during a trial, but that they'll be kept completely from it.
So the first pillar of this whole argument really rests on this one verse, Revelation 3:10. Our source material points to this as a direct promise from Jesus himself. That phrase, the hour of trial, is seen as the tribulation, and the entire interpretation really hangs on those three crucial little words, keep you from. And this is where it gets really specific. That phrase, keep you from, comes from a tiny but powerful Greek word, ek. The source really emphasizes this, saying ek means out of, in the sense of a complete evacuation. See, if the idea was just to protect believers through the trial, a different Greek word, dia, would have made more sense. So the language itself seems to suggest a total removal, not just being kept safe in the middle of the storm.
Okay, so we have a promise in the New Testament. But how does an Old Testament prophecy tie into all this? Well, for the second argument, we have to go way back to the book of Daniel and a very specific timeline given to the nation of Israel.
Now, right from the get-go, this prophecy has a very specific audience. The source material stresses that it's for your people, that's the Israelites, and for your holy city, Jerusalem. This framing is so important because it's presented as a divine clock that is ticking specifically for the nation of Israel and no one else.
Okay, this timeline is absolutely crucial, so let's walk through it. The source explains this prophecy in three distinct chunks. First, you have the 69 weeks, which are seen as already fulfilled, ending with the arrival of the Messiah. At that point, Israel's prophetic clock is said to have paused. That pause creates this gap you see in the middle, the period we are in right now, the church age. And that leaves just one final week, the 70th week, a 7-year period that is still to come. And that period is identified as the tribulation.
So what's the big takeaway from this timeline? Well, the conclusion that's drawn is that the church's entire existence fits neatly inside that prophetic gap. And since that final 70th week is designated specifically for Israel, the argument is that the church simply won't be on earth for it. The idea is that the church is removed before Israel's prophetic clock starts ticking again.
All right, the third piece of this puzzle, according to our source, is found in the very structure of the book of Revelation itself. The argument is that it's meant to be read as a broadly chronological story of what's to come.
Think of this verse as a kind of divinely inspired table of contents for the entire book of Revelation. Notice the three parts. You've got the past, the things which you have seen. You have the present, the things which are, which is understood to be the church age described in chapters 2 and 3. And then you have the future, the things which will take place after this, which kicks off right in chapter 4. And this is where that timeline really snaps into focus. Our source points out that when we get to chapter 4, we see this group of 24 elders in heaven. Now, these figures are widely identified as representing believers, the church. And here they are, already in heaven, crowned and worshiping. The crucial part is when this happens. It happens before the tribulation judgments are unleashed on the earth back in chapter 6.
So let's just lay this sequence out, step by step. It's pretty clear when you see it like this. First, in chapters 2 and 3, you've got the church on earth. Then, boom, a scene change. In chapters 4 and 5, you see believers in heaven. It's only after that has been established that chapter 6 kicks off the tribulation on earth. So the logical question is, how did they get to heaven? The conclusion, according to the source, is that the rapture must have taken place somewhere between the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4.
Okay, so we've looked at a promise, a prophecy, and a chronological sequence. Let's pull all these threads together now and see how they interlock to form one single cohesive argument.
So, to recap the case that our source has built for us, it really stands on these three pillars. You've got the pillar of promise, that believers will be kept from or evacuated out of the hour of trial. You have the pillar of prophecy, Daniel's timeline, which sets the tribulation apart as a time for Israel. And finally, the pillar of chronology, the literal sequence in Revelation that shows believers already in heaven before the judgments begin.
So, when you weave these three threads together, the promise, the prophecy, and the chronology, the source argues that they paint a very clear picture. And that picture is that the rapture of the church has to happen before that 7-year tribulation gets underway.
And that leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to chew on. If this timeline we've looked at is like a prophetic map, and if we are, right now, living in what it calls the gap, what does that really mean for us, here and now? It's a powerful question, and one the source material leaves us to think about. Thanks so much for joining us.